My name is Margot Hale. I'm 39 years old, a floral designer from Vermont. I spend my days arranging flowers for other people's joy, weddings, anniversaries, family gatherings, making their homes feel warm, even when mine stopped feeling that way a long time ago. Last December, during our family's annual planning call for the New Year's Eve celebration at our mountain lodge, Dad's voice broke through the chatter with a calm that chilled me. "Margot," he said, "traditions are for parents. You can skip this year?" For a moment, I thought he was joking, but Mom didn't look up. She was holding a notepad, and I saw the guest list in her neat handwriting. The Wilsons, the Carters, the Lanes, Lucas and Angela, neighbors, my brother, his fiancée, but not me. That's how I found out. I wasn't invited to the tradition I'd spent years keeping alive. Not through anger, not through arguments, just silence. If you've ever been quietly left out by your own family, not because you did something wrong, but because they stopped seeing your place, share your story in the comments. I'd really love to know how you handled that kind of silence. I tried to hold my smile on that call, pretending it didn't sting. "Sure, Dad," I said softly. "Maybe next year." While they talked about decorations and recipes, the very things I used to plan, I stayed quiet. They sounded happy. And I realized maybe they already were, without me. When the call ended, my apartment felt smaller. The heater hummed. The candle beside me flickered over a half-finished bouquet, white lilies, pine cones, silver bells, flowers I'd designed for the lodge table, the table that no longer had my name on it. I reached over and blew out the candle. The flame vanished, leaving a faint trail of smoke curling into the dark. For the first time, I understood what my father's words really meant. It wasn't about skipping 1 year. It was about learning that sometimes love has a guest list, and you're not on it anymore. Growing up, our mountain lodge wasn't just a house. It was our heartbeat. Every New Year's Eve, the smell of pine drifted through the halls. Mom tied ribbons on the banisters. Dad tuned the old radio to soft jazz. Outside, the snow glowed blue under the porch light. Inside, everything felt safe, or at least it looked that way. Back then, I didn't notice the small things, the way Dad's laugh grew louder when my brother Lucas spoke, or how Mom's eyes lit up every time he mentioned his grades, his friends, his future. Lucas was the golden boy, the one everyone expected to shine. And me. I was the one who filled in the spaces, the helper, the decorator, the one who made sure things looked perfect. When I was 13, Dad gave Lucas his first fishing rod. He gave me a box of artificial flowers. "Something for you to make things pretty," he said. I remember smiling and saying thank you. But that moment stayed with me for years. It was when I first realized I wasn't meant to belong in their stories, only to make their stories look beautiful. Still, I kept showing up. Every New Year's Eve, I'd be the first one there, stringing lights along the porch railings, arranging centerpieces from whatever flowers survived the cold. Because that's what love looked like to me then, showing up even when no one noticed. Mom would hum along to the radio, and I'd watch her watch Lucas, the way she reached out to fix his collar, how she laughed a little louder when he told a joke that wasn't even funny. By the time I turned 25, Lucas had moved to Boston, and I was living an hour away, trying to build my career as a floral designer. I didn't make much then, just enough to get by. But every December, I'd drop my projects, close my studio early, and drive through the snow to help Mom prepare the lodge. She'd tell me, "You always make it feel like home." I clung to that sentence like it was proof I mattered. There was one year I'll never forget. I'd just received an offer to design floral installations for a winter gala in Montreal. It was the kind of opportunity that could have changed my career, but it fell on the same weekend as our New Year's gathering. When I told Mom about it, she smiled, a polite, empty kind of smile, and said, "You can go, honey, if you want, but it won't be the same without your touch here." I remember hanging up that call, staring at the contract on my desk, and knowing exactly what I'd do. I turned down the job, telling myself family comes first. That weekend, I drove through a snowstorm to decorate the lodge, lit every candle, polished every glass, and filled the rooms with white roses and evergreen branches. Everyone said it was the most beautiful New Year we'd ever had, but no one asked what it had cost me. That's the thing about being the responsible one. The quiet, dependable daughter. People start assuming you'll always show up. They stop seeing it as a choice and start treating it as your duty. As years passed, Lucas became the success story, a finance director with a fiancé from a family that looked perfect on paper. Dad bragged about him at every dinner. Mom talked about his new house in every call. When it came to me, the topic shifted quickly. How's business? Still doing flowers? I'd smile, say yes, and pretend it didn't hurt. But I think the truth is, I kept trying to earn what they were never willing to give. Their recognition. Their pride. And every year when I decorated the lodge, I told myself maybe this would be the year they'd finally see me. Not just as the daughter who made things pretty, but as someone they were proud to belong to. So when Dad told me to skip this year, it wasn't just about one celebration. It was like every sacrifice, every drive through snow, every flower I'd ever arranged for them, suddenly meant nothing. And the cruelest part? I couldn't even be angry, because deep down I'd known for years I was the only one still trying to hold us together. The week after that call, Vermont sank into deep winter. The roads were glass, the trees dressed in white silence, and every shop window glowed with warmth I couldn't feel. I tried to bury myself in work, new clients, new arrangements, anything to keep from thinking about the empty space where our family tradition used to live. But silence has a way of finding you. On the morning of New Year's Eve, while I was wrapping white roses for a wedding order, my phone buzzed with a notification, a message from my mother. It wasn't an apology. It was a photo. The picture showed the lodge, glowing under a string of golden lights. The same lights I'd bought last year. The porch was lined with pine garlands and candles, my old design. For a moment I thought maybe they'd changed their minds. Maybe they wanted me there after all. Then I saw it. In the center of the photo stood Angela, my brother's fiancée, holding one of my signature arrangements. White lilies, pine cones, silver bells, my exact design. But on the tag hanging from the vase, written in my mother's handwriting, were the words, "Floral Concept by Angela Lane." I stared at it until my eyes blurred. I could almost hear Dad's voice, saying how talented she was, how she made the place come alive again. It wasn't just that I'd been replaced, it was that my work, my touch, my years of devotion, had been handed to someone else, as if it were a gift easily rewrapped. That was the second betrayal, the kind that doesn't scream. It whispers, "You never really mattered." I sat on my studio floor, surrounded by petals and ribbons, feeling smaller than I had in years. The heater clicked off. Outside, snow was falling, soft, endless. And I thought about how many winters I'd spent making that lodge beautiful, thinking that if I worked hard enough, maybe they'd finally see me. But they had seen me all along. They just never looked long enough to care. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and opened social media. I shouldn't have. But curiosity, that cruel little thing, got the best of me. There it was, a whole album of photos from the party. The same decorations, the same theme, the same color palette I'd created for years. Only this time, every caption said, "Designed by Angela." In one photo, Dad stood beside her, smiling proudly. Mom had written underneath, "So thankful for Angela's help. The place looks magical again." I laughed then, a quiet, broken kind of laugh. It wasn't bitter. It was disbelief. How do you mourn something that died so quietly you didn't even know when it happened? Around midnight, while they toasted under my lights, I sat on my porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the fireworks from miles away. They looked small from here, distant bursts of color fading into black sky. For the first time, I didn't make a wish. I'd run out of them. That's when my phone buzzed again. A message from Lucas. "Hey, just wanted you to know everyone misses you. Angela's decorations turned out great. You'd be proud." The word stung more than any insult. I typed a reply, "Tell her she did a beautiful job," then deleted it before hitting send. Instead, I opened the folder where I'd kept photos of every new year I'd ever decorated. Year after year. The same warm glow, the same smiles, the same version of family I'd been trying to hold together. And now, looking at them, all I could think was how staged it all seemed, how carefully I'd arranged everything, the flowers, the laughter, the illusion of belonging. Maybe it was never real. Maybe I'd just been designing a feeling, the way I design bouquets, fragile, temporary, destined to fade. By the time midnight passed, the only light left came from the candle I'd relit, the same one I'd blown out days ago. Its small flame flickered against the frost on my window, and I whispered to myself, almost without meaning to, "Let it burn, this time." Because maybe I needed to stop blowing out my own light, just to make everyone else's shine brighter. That was the night I decided something would change. Not out of anger, but survival. I didn't know what I'd do yet, but I knew I wouldn't stay in that quiet place they'd built for me, the corner where love was conditional and gratitude had someone else's name on it. After that night, something inside me went still, not broken, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after you finally stop begging to be heard. I spent the next few days in my studio, finishing orders in silence, carefully tying ribbons around other people's happiness. Then one morning, while sorting through invoices, I found an old postcard tucked between my sketchbooks. It was from Savannah, Georgia, a photo of a garden I'd visited years ago, its archways covered in jasmine and wild roses. On the back, in my handwriting, were 4 words: "Go where you can breathe." I don't remember when I wrote it, but reading it felt like finding a message from a braver version of myself. That afternoon, I packed a single suitcase. I didn't leave a note for my parents, or for Lucas. They hadn't noticed my silence for years. They wouldn't start now. I booked a one-way train ticket south. The snow gave way to rain as Vermont disappeared behind me, white fading into green, cold fading into something softer. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty for leaving. I just felt light. When I arrived in Savannah, the air smelled like magnolia and salt. The streets were lined with oak trees heavy with moss. Even the wind felt unhurried. I rented a small apartment above an old bookstore, peeling blue shutters, a balcony overlooking the square. The first morning there, I woke up to birds instead of silence. It felt strange to wake up in a place that didn't expect anything from me. I started walking every evening after work, past the fountains, past the old houses painted in sun-faded colors. Sometimes I'd stop by the market, buy a handful of flowers just to arrange them for myself. No deadlines, no expectations, just beauty, quiet and personal. One afternoon, I met Clara Jennings, a retired art teacher who ran a small garden behind her gallery. She saw me sketching near the fence and invited me in. "Help me with these azaleas," she said. She reminded me of who I used to be, before I tried so hard to please everyone. We started talking. She told me about her own daughter, how they hadn't spoken in years, after a family argument. "It's funny," Clara said, brushing soil off her hands. "The people we love the most are the ones we try hardest to change, and the ones least willing to see how we've changed." Her words landed like truth I'd been too afraid to say out loud. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the balcony, watching the lanterns swing in the warm breeze, and realized something simple, yet freeing. I didn't need my family's approval to keep existing. I just needed my own permission to begin again. In the following weeks, Clara offered me a small section of her garden to use for floral installations. I spent hours there, hands in the dirt, rebuilding something from nothing. Not for a client, not for my father's praise, just because it felt right. People started stopping by to watch. A woman asked if I taught classes. Another asked if I could help decorate her daughter's wedding. And without planning to, I found myself designing again, but this time for joy. Sometimes, after work, I'd check my phone out of habit. There were missed calls from Mom, a few texts from Lucas, ones that started with, "We miss you," and ended with, "Angela's thinking of reaching out." But I didn't reply. I wasn't angry anymore. I just didn't feel the need to go back. Because what would I be returning to? A place where my name was missing from the list. A home where my flowers bloomed under someone else's name. One evening, Clara handed me an envelope. It was an invitation, a local art showcase for floral design. "Submit one piece," she said, "something that tells your story." I thought about it for days. And then, the night before the deadline, I knew exactly what to make. I created an arrangement of white lilies and wild jasmine, bound together with silver ribbon and pine branches, the same flowers I'd used for my family's lodge. But this time, I added something new. A single candle at the center, flickering softly against the petals. I called it "The Light I Kept." When the judges asked what it meant, I said, "It's about the kind of love that survives even when it's not returned." They nodded. But I wasn't talking about romance. I was talking about family. That night, as the lights dimmed and the crowd applauded, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not pride exactly, but peace. Because for the first time, I wasn't designing beauty for someone else's table. I'd built something that was completely, quietly, mine. It had been 6 months since I left Vermont. Savannah had changed me in ways I couldn't explain. The slower pace, the soft light, the quiet freedom of building a life that didn't depend on anyone's approval. I thought I'd left the past behind completely, but one afternoon, as I was watering the jasmine in Clara's garden, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. But something, maybe instinct, maybe unfinished business, made me answer. "Margot?" It was my mother's voice, softer than I remembered, hesitant. "Hi, Mom," I said carefully. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "Your father's retiring. We're hosting a small gathering at the lodge this weekend. Your brother thought it might be nice if you came." For a moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The same lodge, the same people who told me to skip this year. And now they wanted me back, not to apologize, not to reconcile, but to decorate their farewell. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," I said. "Margot," she whispered, "it's been so long." Her voice trembled, and for a second, I heard something unfamiliar in it. Regret. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood by the window, looking at the garden I'd helped revive. Clara's words echoed in my mind. The people we love the most are often the ones we must learn to forgive, not for them, but for our own peace. By morning, I'd made my decision, not out of obligation, but closure. I packed a bag, tucked one of my new floral designs inside, "The Light I Kept," and boarded the first flight north. When I reached the lodge, the snow was falling again, just like last year. But it felt different now. Back then, I'd stood outside that place as someone desperate to be let in. Now, I walked toward it as someone who didn't need their permission to enter. Through the frosted windows, I saw familiar faces, the Wilsons, the Carters, the same neighbors who'd filled my absence, and near the fireplace, my family. Mom arranging plates, Dad in his favorite sweater, Lucas and Angela, still glowing with that effortless confidence. When Mom saw me at the door, she froze, her hand still clutching a napkin. "Margot," she breathed, like saying my name might make me vanish. Then Dad turned. "Didn't think you'd come," he said, voice steady, but his eyes uncertain. "I wasn't sure either," I answered. The air felt heavy with all the words we'd never said. Angela smiled nervously. "It's good to see you again, Margot." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I wasn't angry anymore. She'd just been playing a part in a story I no longer belonged to. "I'm glad you're well," I said simply. Then I turned to Dad. "Can I talk to you?" "All of you?" They nodded. The room went still. Even the fire seemed to quiet down. I set down the arrangement I'd brought, white lilies, jasmine, pine, with a single candle glowing at the center. The same design they'd once taken from me, but this time with my name signed at the bottom of the tag. "This is for you," I said. "It's called The Light I Kept." Dad stared at it, then back at me. "You made this?" I nodded. "Every piece. Every petal." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Margot, we didn't mean to hurt you." I swallowed hard. "I know." "You didn't have to mean it for it to hurt." Mom stepped closer, her voice trembling. "We thought you needed space. You always seemed so independent." "I was," I said softly. "Because I had to be. You never left me room to need anyone." She blinked, tears forming, but I didn't stop. "I gave up jobs, holidays, my own plans, all for this family. Not because you asked, but because I believed it meant something. And when you told me to skip the year, it felt like you erased me from my own story." Dad looked down. "Maybe we took you for granted," he admitted. "You always made things run so smoothly, I never thought about how much work it was." "Or how much it cost," I added. For the first time, Lucas spoke. "Margot, I'm sorry. About the decorations, the credit, that was Mom's idea." Angela didn't know Mom gasped. "Lucas!" But he kept going. "I told them it wasn't right. But they said it would make things less awkward." A silence fell over the room. Not sharp, just heavy. The truth, sitting there like something fragile, finally set down. I took a slow breath. "I'm not here for an apology," I said. "I just needed to say this. I'm done earning my place here. If you want me in your life, you'll have to see me as I am, not just the girl who makes things beautiful for everyone else." Dad's eyes softened, his voice low. "You have your mother's stubbornness." "Maybe," I said with a faint smile. But this time, it saved me. For a while, no one said anything. Then Mom reached out, hesitant. "Would you stay for dinner?" I looked around, at the familiar walls, the table that once made me feel invisible, the garlands that no longer carried my touch, and I smiled, gently. "Not tonight," I said, "but maybe next time." As I turned to leave, I saw the candle in my arrangement flicker. Its flame caught the reflection in the window, one small, steady light against the snow. I walked outside, the cold air biting my cheeks, and for the first time in years, the mountain didn't feel like a place I'd been exiled from. It felt like somewhere I'd finally said goodbye to properly. Behind me, through the window, I saw Dad lean forward, touching the vase gently, reading the small tag aloud. "The Light I Kept," by Margot Hale. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. When I got back to Savannah, the air was softer, the kind that carried the scent of salt and new beginnings. I walked straight to Clara's garden, still wearing the same coat I'd worn at the lodge. The jasmine had bloomed early, brushing against the wind like tiny white flames. I set my suitcase down and took a long breath. I didn't feel victorious, and I didn't feel sad. I just felt free. For years, I'd measured my worth by how much space I could take up in other people's lives. Now, I understood something quieter, but truer. That love built on conditions will always make you smaller, and the moment you stop shrinking to fit, you start to become who you were meant to be. I spent that evening arranging new flowers for Clara's window, not white lilies or pine cones anymore, but wild flowers, yellow, pink, and violet, colors that didn't ask for permission to bloom. As I tied the final ribbon, I caught my reflection in the glass, For the first time, I didn't see the daughter who wasn't invited. I saw a woman who chose herself and kept the light anyway. Later, I took the candle from my bag, the one I'd used in the light I kept, and placed it on the edge of the balcony. The flame trembled once, then steadied. It glowed against the night sky like a quiet promise. You can lose everything you thought you needed and still be whole. The next morning, I opened my messages. There were dozens of notifications, people sharing my exhibit online, strangers writing how it made them cry. But one message stood out, from Mom. Just 4 words. "Your light changed me." I didn't reply. Not yet. Some wounds don't need words to heal. Just time. As the sun rose over the square, I leaned on the balcony railing, listening to the city waking up, the laughter below, the hum of life moving forward, and I thought, maybe family isn't the people who share your name, but the ones who help you remember it. If you've ever had to walk away from people you love just to find yourself again, tell me in the comments. Because stories like that, they help others remember they're not alone. And if this story stayed with you, if you've ever kept a small light burning through the dark, remember to like, subscribe, and share. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that it's okay to start over.